The verb conocer in Spanish means to be familiar with or be acquainted with people, places, and things in general. Unlike the verb saber, which means to know something factually or do something, the verb conocer tends to lean more towards acquaintances of ideas rather than knowing ideas. And if you think about it, there's a big difference between knowing something from top to bottom and knowing something that isn't fully clear, which is the reason why Spanish creates two verbs for to know, because one verb means to know something factually and completely, whereas the other indicates being acquainted with something rather than fully knowing what it is. The syntax of conocer follows the normal conjugation pattern of verbs ending in er, aside from the yo pronoun, which is irregular, following the tsko ending. Like I said at the beginning, conocer means more being familiar with people, places, and things in general, rather than knowing something factually. Therefore, yo conozco means I'm familiar with a person, place, or thing, rather than me knowing something factually, because being familiar with a person, place, or thing doesn't necessarily mean that I know it from top to bottom. Tú conoces means you're familiar with, él conoce means he's familiar with, nosotros conocemos, we're familiar with, vosotros conocéis, y'all are familiar with, and ellos conocen, they're familiar with. As always, try not focusing on these pronouns because they're not that useful in conversation. Overall, the verb conocer is actually considered to be a very useful verb in Spanish because it helps to differentiate the qualities of knowing something factually and being familiar with a person, place, or thing, which is sort of the same way the verbs ser and estar work. Conocer, as a matter of fact, is very useful when it comes down to asking questions, and it actually uses direct object pronouns to replace people, places, and things, which could all be nouns. For instance, if I ask you, ¿conoces la ciudad de Las Vegas? I'm not necessarily asking you if you know the city of Las Vegas, but rather if you're familiar with the city of Las Vegas, and you can reply with something like, sí, yo conozco la ciudad, or if you want to use a direct object pronoun, you can simply say, sí, yo la conozco. The reason why the verb saber cannot be used here is because by saying, ¿sabes la ciudad de Las Vegas? The verb saber would have to imply that you know the city of Las Vegas from top to bottom, including the people, streets, food, and everything in general, which would be impossible to know, ultimately resulting in an incorrect use of saber, which is why Spanish calls the term conocer being familiar with rather than fully knowing the person, place, or thing. There are more examples that you can make with conocer, like asking about people, ¿conoces a John? Meaning, are you familiar with John? And as you can see, Spanish decides to use the personal preposition a when it comes down to being familiar with people. But in this case, you can just consider the preposition to be the equivalent of the preposition with in English. So whenever you refer to people in general, you always have to include the personal a. And with the sentence, ¿conoces a John? You can reply with, sí, yo conozco a John, or if you want to use a direct object pronoun, you can say, sí, yo lo conozco. There are of course more examples that you can make with conocer, like él conoce a mi abuelo, he is familiar with my granddad, or maybe yo conozco los libros, I'm familiar with the books, or maybe if you want to include an infinitive inside, you can say tú quieres conocer el país, which would mean you want to be familiar with the country, as country refers to a physical place. Overall, conocer is an eminent verb in Spanish because it helps you understand how to think of people, places, and things in general by being familiar with these ideas rather than fully and factually knowing everything about people, places, and things. I actually don't understand why teachers teach both of these verbs at once, as I see the two verbs having completely different definitions, and so mainly, each verb needs its own explanation of how to work with it. This has been the verb conocer in Spanish. Thank you for watching this video, and hopefully, I made your learning just a bit simpler.